particular case, this is all linear viscous, this setup.
So what's the difference in the yellow, the blue, the red? I mean, these are, what causes them to be different viscosity?
I just preset here the viscosity of the channel. I use a low viscosity. We see it on the next slide. Or maybe let's put this one. So here you see the viscosity plot. It's all linear viscous. This is for a very thin channel, 0.2 kilometers. You don't even see it on this plot, but if you use an unstructured mesh, you can resolve it. And I have a density difference. So this is like a plume that comes up. Yeah? And the question here is, and what I show on the right here, is the vertical velocity. So in this particular case, even though there is a pre-existing channel, there is actually not much flow going upwards in this channel, and this is actually shown here on the right. This is the vertical velocity at the center of the model in the middle of your dike. So what you basically see is that the vertical velocity in the middle of the dike is actually quite small. And then I have a movie here, which I will show 2 times, in which we start to vary the width of this channel, and you see that there are different regimes. Yeah? There is one regime where we indeed have a channel-like flow. Then we have a regime where basically this plume rises and spreads underneath the lithosphere asthenosphere boundary. And then we have another intermediate regime, what you see. So basically here you start to see the result you would probably have expected, that this density difference actually triggers vertical flow, a pipe flow in the dike, yeah? And which you can also see nicely here. But if you make the dike much wider, yeah, then you actually get a Rayleigh-Taylor instability over here at the interface. And if you make the viscosity of the asthenosphere much higher, then you also start to change the behavior. So this is if the viscosity of the asthenosphere is like 10 to the 23. Yeah, so we have 3 different regimes, very simple models. We have the Stokes, that's what I would call the Stokes flow regime, so it's just the plume that spreads underneath the lithosphere asthenosphere boundary. Then we have this channel flow regime, where you actually pump magma through your mantle lithosphere, and then we have this other regime which I call the Stokes in the channel. So basically we have some deformation happening here, but not much actually goes up. Now in all cases, we actually of course know the scaling of this. This should scale approximately as a Stokes rising sphere. I numerically computed the vertical velocities, and I do a fit because there are some fitting constants, because it's not an infinite half space that you're looking at, but it is close to a rigid boundary here, etc. It's 2D, not 3D. This is the channel flow regime, so it's just Poiseuille flow driven by the density pressure difference along the channel, so basically density from here to here. And this is also an intermediate regime. So you can put up, you can construct a phase diagram with all those regimes, and it turns out that there are 3 modes of deformations. We have the channel mode, the Stokes mode, and the Stokes in the channel regime, and you can plot this for various ratios. This is, for example, for the dike width, 1/4 of the radius of the initial inclusion. Okay, so this is just purely mechanical. If you want to actually bring magma up in nature, then you need to move the magma sufficiently fast so it doesn't crystallize before it reaches, let's say, the crust. So you have an additional constraint that the advection should be faster than diffusion. The advection time scale is, of course, the length of your channel divided over the velocity, and the diffusion length scale has to do with the width of this dike, and you can spell that out, and it turns out that there is a viscosity ratio that you should have that is higher than this. And there's something which you could call a channel Rayleigh number that looks very similar to a Rayleigh number of convection. So if we look at dimensional numbers, then it turns out that this channel Rayleigh number should be between 10 to the minus 3 and 10 to the 6, and we can plot this in a regime diagram here, and from that we can get estimates of the viscosity. So now this is maybe a little bit difficult to interpret in non-dimensional units, but if we plot this with dimensional numbers, I've shown this here. This is for a radius of 20 kilometers and a viscosity of the asthenosphere of 10 to the 18, and this is for 10 to the 20. And this basically is the part of the regime where you would have channel-like motion, and it also shows you the maximum viscosity that the channel should have. So you should have a lower viscosity than that inside the weak zone to bring the magma up. So what you can conclude from this is that it is actually feasible to pump magma through a dike-like channel, but it requires some special conditions. You cannot do this all the time. Yeah? So does this have some applications? I think it does. The first application is the Condor ultramafic intrusive complex that Taras discussed yesterday a little bit. I like this because I actually did my diploma mapping project in here. It's far away, and it's a pure dunite that is intruded in very low grade sedimentary rocks, no more than 1 or 2 kilometers depth. And this is several kilometers in radius, and it is a bit puzzling because the density of dunite is of course much higher than the density of the surrounding rocks. Taras did some modeling of this and proposed this model that you saw here yesterday, and basically suggested if you have a pre-existing channel that is sufficiently long, you can actually bring this material up. Now if you plot this on my phase diagram, then we can plot basically the channel length versus the channel width. And you see that for the asthenosphere viscosity of 10 to the 18, which I got from his simulations, and the density difference, then it actually requires the channel viscosity to have a viscosity less than 10 to the 16 Pascal seconds. And this is actually, if you read the paper very carefully, this is what he used. Probably Taras had been playing the parameters and initially used the higher viscosity, and then those things don't go up. Yeah? So maybe you can confirm that later. Another application.
Lucky because I used somebody else flow law for the molten rock, and for exponential factor was low enough. So
this could also be. Now another application for this, and working on this with Oliver Yakut from MIT, and he did some mapping in Beni Bussero, and there he also has field evidence of channel-like like things that look fairly similar but on a smaller scale. And you can plot this in the same diagram here, and it would still fit the observation. So it's at least mechanically possible to do this. We can also analyze our simulations I showed you a little bit earlier. And the first one, I first started off with a very large plume. So the plume had a radius of 40 kilometers, and this was in the Stokes mode regime. Then we started with a smaller plume, here, which is still in the Stokes mode regime. And then finally we got at the boundary and below. So this explains exactly why in some cases it actually pumps magma into the lithosphere and other cases not. So it also means that very large plumes in this particular setup would not actually make it immediately to the surface. Yeah? They could of course break and rupture the whole lithosphere, but only like intermediate sized pulses would actually make it up to higher parts of the lithosphere. So just to summarize this part, I think that the lithospheric mantle above a melt segregation zone is likely to be weakened by whatever process. If this is the case, and we have a weak zone, then there is actually 3 modes of deformation, and only this channel-like mode can rapidly transport melt to the lower crust. And this is feasible on Earth, but only under certain conditions. So simply making a larger plume is not going to bring necessarily up much more magma in this particular case. Okay, that brings me to the second part of my presentation, because I want to look at how to intrude felsic magmas in the continental crust. And this is a spectacular picture of Torres del Paine, and this is one of the few laccoliths, batholiths on Earth where we have a fully three-dimensional exposure. This is perfectly mapped, and you can see the contact with the top and the bottom, so you can actually study how this has been intruded and how this worked with time. And people from Switzerland have been working on this for the last decade or so, and I was happy to be tagged along on a field trip there. And the result of this is that actually this Torres del Paine consists of 3 granite pulses, and with high precision dating they could actually show that the uppermost granite pulse cooled and intruded first and was crystallized by the time the second pulse came and before the third pulse came. So the time scale over which these were injected is in the order of 20,000 years. The granite chamber is more or less homogeneous, except in the feeder zone where most rocks are vertical and you have mafic rocks and not granitic ones. They can show petrologically that the two are genetically linked. So basically, their conceptual idea is that these granites have been formed by fractional crystallization of the more mafic rocks somewhere in the mid-crust. So this structure has grown incrementally, and you can clearly see that the earlier pulses have been crystallized by the time the later came in, because you see dikes shooting through the earlier pulses. Another example is the Adamello batholith, which is in northern Italy. This is the largest batholith of the Alps, and we had a larger project in Switzerland studying this. And again, here they did high precision uranium lead dating, and they could show that that little part of this batholith here was actually formed by several batches of intrusion of mafic, initially mafic rocks and later more granodioritic and tonalitic rocks, and that this happened over a time scale of about 300,000 years, whereas the mafic pulses came in faster. So again, here we can clearly show that this Pluton has been grown by several smaller batches of magma. The same thing in the Sierra Nevada batholiths, where the age of the whole system spans a time range from 76 million years to over almost 200 million years. So this has been active for a very long amount of time, and within a single batholith over here you can distinguish different pulses of magma that also vary. In this particular case, they were injected over a time scale of about 10 million years. So obviously this magma system were not formed by a single big intrusion of magma, but also, as Chloe already said, by many smaller pulses of magma. The thermal effects have been studied quite well over the last 10-20 years. For example, Catherine Annan in Bristol looked at this, and this is one simulation where she looked at the thermal cooling. If you instantaneously place a big magma body in the crust, you let it cool with time, then you will have like slowly cooling with time, and you will have actually quite a bit of molten material for quite a long period of time. If you do the same thing by adding several pulses and several cells, then you actually generate much less magma at any given point in time. So it's more likely that this is the mush chamber and it's not the magma chamber. And then it of course depends on the rate of emplacement, how much molten material is there. Now actually, there have been a lot of this kind of thermal models, thermal petrological models. There have been some one-dimensional models in how these magmatic systems might work in the continental lithosphere, but there's actually quite little work done on trying to understand how this works in a more complex lithosphere in 2D or 3D. Of course, we all know this analog experiment, so you have seen pictures of this. This example of Cruden that looked at the deformation around a rising diapir. These are some early models by Prof, where they looked at the interaction between a rising plume and lithosphere. And this is one of the few papers that looked at a bit more detail at what happens if you have intrusion of a mafic melt in the lower crust, and how this interacts with basically the generation of and the rise of felsic melts within the crust. But actually none of these models actually include multiple pulses. And as we saw before, that is an increasing body of evidence that this is really what we need to look at in the continental lithosphere. Now there has also been a very long-standing debate in structural geology, like 100 years fight, over whether these plutons rise by diapirs or as dikes. And so you probably guess what I'm getting at. We want to actually create a very simple numerical model in which we actually don't fully include this diking fully consistent way, but we implement it in a parameterized way. And we also will look at the effect of having multiple pulses. Now this is a very simple setup, so I start with instantaneously placing a magma body, a felsic, granitic magma body here at around the moho. and then periodically it plays a new one at this location. I use the normal flow laws of rocks, wet quartzite, mafic, rheology, etc. And we take into account a melting diagram. This is calibrated for the Sierra Nevada rocks. And most importantly, we take into account a parameterization of diking. Now, as you will all realize, it's not possible to resolve a 1 meter dike in this kind of models, where maybe the grid size is half a kilometer by half a kilometer. So what we did instead is we did a small parameterization of what happens if you have like intrusion of several dikes next to each other. They will be hot, they will have a certain spacing, and it turns out that you can approximate that thermally by a very simple function where you put a certain, you just make this zone a little bit hotter than the surrounding rocks. And that approximation works actually quite well, so you approximate the real one with less than 5% difference after a few thousand years. Yeah, if we wait about 10,000 years, which is a typical time step of our simulation, then there is actually very little difference. So we actually we initiate a dike if the stresses locally are higher than the tensile strength. So this is very similar to what Tobias Keller found in his more complete models. And we assume that this dike zone is vertical, and they are quite big. So they are 10 by 2 kilometers or 5 by 1 kilometer. That is because we want to resolve them numerically. Yeah, and if we resolve the dike here, if we intrude the dike here, we lower the average temperature of the partially molten chamber. Now I want to just show you how this looks like. These red things you see here, these are the pseudo dikes, and this is a typical simulation. And here, in this case, we emplace a new pulse every million years with a radius of 10 kilometers. Yeah? And what you see is it will start heating up the crust. We get a lot of mixing here, and the new pulses rise very rapidly, and then finally it will almost make it to the surface. So this is a simplified magmatic system. I mean, these are very simple models, but it does give you the idea that this is this behaves quite different than having a single pulse only. So we can also look at the melt content. So we start with a very hot pulse, so it's fully molten, and then it very rapidly crystallizes here, and yeah.
You become a cardiologist, it looks like.
True. All right. Okay, so the temporal evolution of this looks like this. So it slowly eats its way up in the towards the upper crust. You have a zone that is partially molten for quite some period of time, and at the end, the buoyancy of this whole system is sufficient to start initiating shear zones in the upper crust. Now, if we use, you're probably wondering what if we would use smaller zones? This was for 10 times 2 kilometer zone. So what if we use 5 by 1 kilometer zones? Well, it turns out that it's actually very similar behavior. It's slightly slower to reach the upper crust here. So it doesn't actually matter too much. Now, if you start with the hotter initial crust, and all these models have a Moreau temperature of 500 degrees, if we just change the geotherm and assume that the lower crust is a bit hotter, the behavior is quite different. Or we have actually some downward flow of this upper crust to the base, and this makes my co-authors quite happy because they did a lot of field work in the Sierra Nevada, and they found evidence that volcanic rocks that were at the surface at some stage were actually now at a depth of about 30 kilometers right next to intruding plutons, and that's what actually got them into this project in the first place. Yeah, how do you explain that you have rocks that were close to the surface, that they are now at depth right at the contact? So this would be one explanation.
Can I just clarify, your 10 by 1 or 5 by 2 sets the height that each of those dikes go when it pops? Okay.
Yeah, and I just increased the temperature in that zone. So if you actually look carefully, you see that those zones are hot and then immediately cool. There, you saw it there. Okay, and we try to conserve energy by then lowering the temperature of the partially molten like magma chamber. Okay, so now if we do a faster pulsing rate and we have a strong lower crust, so in this case we have a faster beating heart every 0.3 million years. What is very important is actually the strength of the lower crust. So if you have a stronger lower crust, you have a more focused magmatic zone. Yeah, it's only 30 kilometers wide in this case. So these models are give you some kind of insight. So what happens if I only do a single pulse and I don't have multiple pulses? Well, the answer is not much. Yeah, if you have a single pulse that is small, it just cools, crystallizes, and not much happens. Yeah, and the crystallization time is of course related to the thermal diffusion time scale. What happens if I don't have any of this pseudo-diking active? That's what you see here. In this case, we had a relatively weak lower crust, so you actually spread this magma in the lower crust, but you will never activate, or you will never bring it up in the upper crust because it's simply the viscosity is too high for the upper crust. And this has been one of the counter arguments against diaperic rise for a long time, and this is exactly what you see. So it spreads, this is the plot of the viscosity, it spreads in the lower crust, yeah, but it will not make it to higher regions. And if you have a strong lower crust, then it will actually reach it, and at some point you can even get an uplift at the surface and get fault zones due to that. Now if you do a very hot and weak lower crust, then it starts convecting because it's everywhere partially molten, and you get a large, basically convecting system. Yeah? So these results are somewhat consistent with earlier results we have seen, and they seem to make sense. So just to give you an overview, if you have a weak and cold crust, then we have a very localized one. If you have a weak and warm crust, then it's a bit more difficult to make it up to the surface. If you have multiple pulses and no dikes, it will not make it at all into the lower crust, and single pulse will also not work. So we have tested a few other phenomena or scenarios, and they all give more or less similar results. So what you could basically say is that if we interpret the simulations, if you would start with initiation of an arc, then initially you would expect like this to be relatively cold, so diking should dominate. If you have a cold lithosphere that's sufficiently viscous, and you actually get sufficiently large stresses to allow diking to even initiate. And then once you have a more evolved system, your magma pulses will come up to shallower depths and might in some cases even reach the surface. And then if you have a very involved system, then you might even get this partial convection in the lower crust, which some people say might be the case in South America. So just to summarize this, yeah, I think that this shows clearly that multiple pulses is something that we should really take into account in this kind of models. Just looking at one single pulse is probably not enough, and that we need some kind of diking-like rise mechanism in the crust to actually look at this. Now these models are of course very, very simple. Yeah, I assume that we have already a fully developed felsic melt at the Moho. And I think most petrologists will say this is completely ridiculous, and what we should have instead is a mesh zone or a mafic zone, which then evolves with time, and once you have fractional crystallization going up. Yeah? So these are highly simplistic models, and it's just really a first step in this direction. So the last few slides I want to spend discussing a few open questions in this respect, and I hope to convince some of you that maybe this is really an interesting topic to start working on. Now, if you're interested in the science related to magmatic systems, there were two issues of elements which you can find online, one in April 2015, the other one in April 2016, maybe April next year we have another one. And the first one looks at the magmatic tempos, at whether this magmatism in continental arcs is actually continuous with time or not, and most authors there conclude it's not continuous with time, but there are periods with magmatic flare-ups where you have much more magmatic activity than in other periods. This might be, or this is actually likely to be related to the lithospheric scale deformation, but how that is in detail is not understood. Another question, as what Gloria was already discussing before, is what is the relationship between this big, large-scale magma chambers and volcanic eruptions you have on the top? Yeah, or how do these systems work? And I think there is more and more a consensus that the old idea of looking at a magma chamber that is erupting periodically is interesting, but it ignores a whole part of the physics, and that's what's happening underneath. Yeah, so you should actually also look at how the magma comes to that magma chamber in the first place. And this is, these are new results, for example, from Yellowstone. We're living in an exciting time if you're interested in this, because there's a lot of big geophysical projects going on that are looking at this. Yeah, so there was a project on Yellowstone, and this was published a few months ago. There's also an ongoing project on Mount St. Helens, which is probably the largest ever done geophysical study on such system. There are bigger 3D studies in the Andes looking at such systems. So this is the tomographic picture where actually basically they use more seismometers, so they have a higher resolution, and they could for the first time see that there is there's a low velocity anomaly in the upper crust, and there is a much bigger low velocity anomaly deeper in the crust. Earlier studies had imaged this one, but not the deeper one. Yeah, and the interpretation of that is that this is a rhyolitic, maybe mush chamber, which has probably around 9% melt, so not very much melt, and that this is somehow connected to a bigger volume-wise chamber, which has only about 2% partial melt. So you see the melt percentages here are very small. And then you get this kind of cartoon-like interpretations, and this is very typical. You have the literature is full with this kind of cartoon interpretations, but the major question is, how do these magmatic systems work? What is the connection between this basalt here and the rhyolite on top? Why do we have a much more mafic or basaltic magmatism just right next to it, and whereas here we form a big chamber? I think that this is probably related to how the lithosphere works on the larger scale. We have a lot of data available. We know earthquake locations, we have gravity data, we have GPS data, INSAR data, magnetotelluric, seismic receiver functions, and we have a lot of meteorological studies. So all of that data is available, but there are no real dynamic models for this particular system. So I think one way forward could be to try and develop more realistic lithospheric scale models of this system and see which of the geophysical data or for which models can we actually fit the data. And we have been doing this over the last few years, not on a magmatic system, but on the India-Asia collision zone system. And basically what we did there is we use all available data to construct a reasonable input geometry for the lithosphere. This is India and this is Asia, and we assume a thermal structure, or we actually make thermal structure part of the inversion procedure, and then we run many simulations forward in time. Yeah? And if a simulation does not fit the data, then obviously it's not good, so you change the input parameters in an automated manner until you start to get a better fit between the models and the data. And this is done with a Monte Carlo inversion procedure. And we could show at least that for a lithospheric scale collision process that this method works. It's a series of papers. And that the nice thing is that in this particular case we used gravity topography and GPS data as inputs. And the nice thing is that it gives you parameters for example, the effective viscosity of the upper crust or the friction angle of the upper crust. And it gives you uncertainty bounds. Yeah, and that's maybe even more interesting. So it allows testing hypotheses in a dynamic, consistent manner. Now, if you go back to the last slides, I think that this would allow testing, or I personally think that this probably is related to the stress state of the lithosphere, that we have a through-going diking at this location, but not in this particular location. Yeah? And that maybe has to do with how much melt we have, what the effective density is at this location, etc. So I think combining these kind of dynamic models with the observation would be something that is very interesting. Another thing is the kind of models that Tobias has been doing. And this is a simulation from his PhD thesis that he didn't want to show, so I show it to you because he was not happy with the petrology in here. And what you see here is that the first pulse might eat its way up to the lower crust, and if you then later have a second pulse, it actually creates the pathway for the first pulse, and then the second pulse comes in the lower crust and is much hotter, and then it starts melting some crustal material and has consequences. So it would be nice to have a better petrological description of these processes and take into account, which requires taking into account several pulses. There are of course some technical challenges related to that. Yeah, as Tobias already mentioned, the dikes in this kind of simulations, they have a viscosity that is too high. Yeah, we cannot numerically resolve a viscosity of 100 pascal seconds if the surrounding rocks are 10 to the 23 pascal seconds. So the consequence of that is, if you then couple it back with the thermal evolution, is that the dikes propagate too slow and they would crystallize too quickly. But you can actually come up with a parameterization to counteract this effect. Yeah? As Dan pointed out earlier, this is actually a 3D problem, and most of the dikes we see are 3D structures. So we need to solve this in 3D, and as we already learned, this requires powerful multigrid methods. I think it should be done for viscoelastoplastic rheologists. So I started working on that while being here in Cambridge, but unfortunately it was more work than I thought. So I cannot show you results on this yet. Another question is how to best deal with both the 0% and 100% porosity limits. Yeah? So in my view, 100% porosity limit is nothing else but a variable viscosity simulation where you have a channel just like the simulations I showed earlier. The problem there is that we cannot resolve the actual viscosity contrast between magma and rocks because of round-off errors, but we can parameterize this. I think we can counteract that effect.
With elasticity, it might not be a problem because you can, go to Navier-Stokes limit and then just reduce your time step such that your high viscosity contrast never appears as numerical viscosity.
That is correct, but if we have a time step of a few seconds and we want to simulate several million years, then it might become tricky as well.
Yeah, but dikes is propagating probably on the time scales of hours or minutes or days.
Yeah, it's worthwhile pursuing, I agree. Now what if the other thing is that the chemistry is not tracked. So we need to track the evolving chemistry of both the melt and the depletion of the source rocks, and this is a tricky problem. So we actually need, in many continental arcs, there are basically two groups of thinking, but part of the thinking is that fractional crystallization could actually generate granitic rocks, whereas other people say that no, it's due to mixing, or it's due to melting of sedimentary rocks. So actually the partial fractional crystallization model has been reproduced in the lab, for example in ETH Zurich, where they show that if you start with a basaltic melt, you melt this, you take the melt out, you look at the leftover material, you melt it again, etc., etc. At the end of the day, you end up with a composition that's very similar to the rocks seen in Adamello, for example, but only 20% of your original volume ends up being this composition. So then the question is, what happens with the other 80%? And this somehow must have disappeared. And there are a lot of theories about this, but there are very few numerical models. Mark Bain did some models in this direction. What I also think is important, we saw earlier in the last workshop, we saw that we now have experimental permeability constraints from the lab on melting of mantle rocks. The crystal rocks will melt in a very different way. Melting might actually start around garnet crystals in a pillite, and we have actually little constraints on these kind of things. So it would be nice to have more experiments to reproduce this. And some scientific challenges. I think in general it would be nice to compare dynamic models with observations or make testable predictions from these kind of models. for both the present day and the geological past. Yeah, so we can talk to the petrology community. One of the big questions is why does only 10 or 20% of the magma actually ever reach the surface in a volcano and most of it gets stuck? Why is that? How do we actually generate granitic melts? Is it fractional crystallization of mafic melts or crystal melting and anatexis? On these topics there are a lot of also 1D more complicated models, but maybe we should also consider the 2D and how this interacts with the larger scale deformation of the lithosphere. Then this would also allow us to address the feedback of magmatic processes and the growth of the continental crust. So I want to leave it here and to end with some conclusions. I think that I hope to have convinced you that magma or melt migration to the lithosphere is facilitated by this channeling and multiple pulses. We are only just starting with actually modeling magma migration to the continental lithosphere. There are only a handful of papers that even looked at this and compare this to all the papers on mid-oceanic ridges. And what I think we need to do is to directly couple these geophysical observations of magmatic systems with geodynamic models, so actually couple the actual observations with dynamic models and make testable predictions from these forward models and compare them with really an enormous amount of geological, petrological data, 200 years of data and not many years of modeling. So I think we should start working on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we don't have much time for questions, but are there any questions that you would like to ask?
Yeah, in terms of in your beating heart model, the periodicity of what is the mechanism driving the periodicity of the input? Are you thinking these are solitary waves coming from plumes? That's not going to happen in the subduction zone, but what is the mechanism causing the pulsing?
Well, earlier models of Taras, for example, showed that if you have a continuous subduction zone, you have this kind of sedimentary piles that come are more or less periodic. I'm not sure that we understand what controls this periodicity, but there is some periodicity evolved with that. I don't know.
And what is that periodicity? I forgot what your numbers were. These are thousands of years or millions?
And the models, I just impose it. Yeah, and there I do it every 300,000 years or every million years or every 2 million years, something like that. Yeah. But actually, if you compute it, it does actually give magma addition rates similar to what Chloe was talking about, the order of millimeter per year.
I have a question, Boris. It's sort of a philosophical one. You started by really asking, there are these lots of observations, and we really want to know how does the system work, by which I think you mean, what physical processes are responsible for producing the observations, let's say, that we see. But the models clearly are so difficult that a lot of the physical processes need to be parameterized. So you make some difficult choices about how to parameterize, and then you run, and you can make a range of predictions. But in the process, do you risk losing the ability to actually answer the question that you started with? How do you avoid that?
Well, the question is whether these are simple or complicated models or not. What I showed in the first part of the talk is that these might be viscoelastoplastic models and they have everything incorporated, but we can explain what happens in the models in a very simplified manner. Yeah, it's just Stokes flow through a dike. That's it. Yeah, so there's and there I have a scaling law, and that also works no matter what the viscosity is. This you can. I'm very confident extrapolating this to the real magma viscosities. Yeah, so that part. So also having a viscoelastoplastic rheology of the lithosphere is, I think, there are uncertainties in the parameters you put into it. But for example, the uncertainties in the elastic shear modulus are only one order of magnitude. There are of course uncertainties in the viscosity that go into this, but this is actually a chance that we have. So we can actually use these models to actually fit the observations. If they would be completely insensitive to the viscosity of the lithosphere, then we would never have any chance to fit the observations. But luckily, they are sensitive to that, so we think we can actually fit geophysical observations of the present-day state of the lithosphere. And for that, this kind of models, if you want to do an inverse model on this structure, I probably not all that important that you resolve a single dike in this particular case, because it might not actually affect the dynamics that much. Maybe it's the large-scale dynamics that we need to resolve in this particular case. Of course, there are things that we need to parameterize it, and the only real parameterization is the diking itself, because the speed with which this happens is in the model slower than it would happen in reality. So in reality, this would happen faster, and the intruding magma would be a bit hotter. But this is something that you can parameterize. So you can actually model if you have Darcy flow, yeah, and you have there's actually papers that address if you have a dike, an open dike that is fully filled with fluid of a given width, you can compute analytically the permeability of this. And then you can see if you can actually model this velocity correctly with a Darcy flow approximation. It turns out you can. So the kind of approximations we are doing are actually not so bad, I think. As long as the permeability within your zone is sufficiently high, I think we capture the actual physics reasonably well. So in a way you could argue that these models are becoming as complex as nature itself, which is maybe true to some extent, but we actually have a chance because we can change the parameters and we can use this kind of scaling laws, and in many cases the underlying really key physics is much simpler, and you have a chance with this kind of models to figure out what that physics is. So I think it is a useful exercise.
Okay. I think we should thank Boris once again and move on.